It's going to be a very hard thing to concede because we know there was massive fraud. I think that there will be a lot of things happening between now and the 20th of January, a lot of things. Massive fraud has been found. We're like a third world country.
Donald Trump continuing to insist there was a massive fraud in the election. There wasn't. Continuing to insist he won. He didn't. And saying Joe Biden must prove his votes were not the result of fraud before he can enter the White House. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Joe Biden got 6 million more votes than Trump and won 306 electoral votes to Trump's 232. There's been no evidence, zero, that Trump's claims of fraud are true. But he's pursued dozens of court cases pushing those claims, and judges have smacked them down in blunt, brutal, and blistering opinions. A Republican federal district court judge wrote of Trump's case, quote, "This claim, like Frankenstein's monster, has been haphazardly stitched together." A Republican federal appeals court judge appointed by Trump wrote this in ruling against him, quote, "Charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here. Voters, not lawyers, choose the president. Ballots, not briefs, decide elections." So what's the end game in claiming that the election was rigged and can be overturned? And what will be the impact of all this on the Biden presidency and on the Senate runoff elections in Georgia that will decide if Republicans hold on to their majority? Let's ask Alex Burns, national political correspondent for the New York Times, and Reid Epstein, a political correspondent for the Times. Alex, where do we go from here, and what's in it for Trump to continue to talk this way when even now the Attorney General Barr says there's no evidence of fraud, the election results are legitimate, Trump has lost?
Well, Sam, I think it's a couple things. I think that there's the sort of ego side of this, and then there's the more political, I guess you would call it strategy, but I think it's a generous description. On the ego side, the sort of just personal, self side of this, the president doesn't want to say that he has lost. And so he is clinging to whatever he can, whatever thin reed of evidence that he claims there is, even if it's basically non-existent, that there was some kind of chicanery in the election, to drag out this sense that maybe actually he did not lose. I don't think any of us should have any expectation he will ever acknowledge that he was beaten fair and square and beaten pretty convincingly in this election. I think besides that, though, besides the sort of, part of this just comes from his own personality and his aversion to ever acknowledging failure. It does seem to have the effect of bonding him ever more tightly to the share of the Republican Party. And it does seem like it's a majority of voters in the Republican Party that is kind of a Trump personality cult at this point, that they're not just people who are attached to the GOP writ large, but they are attached to Trump personally. And as long as the president continues to drive at this idea that being a good Republican means being loyal to him, and being loyal to him means denying the legitimacy of the election, he is showing his continued power to keep a good number of Republican office holders in line, even behind these really far-fetched claims.
Reid, you pointed out that Joe Biden is only the third man since the Second World War to topple a duly elected president after just one term, that he rebuilt a blue wall by a relatively thin margin. But what's he going to do with that blue wall now? And of course, a lot depends on the Senate runoffs in Georgia. But how is he going to be able to work with Mitch McConnell if Mitch remains the majority leader? Is he going to be able to accomplish a good deal with that Senate? He's dealing with former Senate colleagues now. What is he actually going to be able to accomplish as a Democratic president?
Well, that's the big question that everyone in Washington is trying to figure out at this moment. If Republicans hold one or both of the Georgia Senate seats, like you said, Senator McConnell will remain in charge of the Senate, not just with the majority, but controlling what gets votes, what gets hearings, which of the president's the president-elect's cabinet nominees are even considered. And of course, judges, once there are vacancies for Mr. Biden to try to fill. We don't know. Biden has, since the beginning of his campaign in April of last year, talked a big game about working with Senate Republicans and with McConnell specifically. But there, frankly, has been no evidence that Senator McConnell is interested in lifting a finger to help Biden do much of anything as the president. It certainly wasn't how he operated during the Obama years. And part of the Biden mystique was not only could he win over some of these voters that had gone to President Trump in 2016, but that he could work with Republicans throughout the primary and general election campaigns. And in 40 some days, once the inauguration happens, we'll see whether there's any real currency to that.
The president has said he would abide by the decision of the Electoral College, which is going to meet shortly. But Alex, you said that the president stress tested the electoral system, and some of the cracks in that system showed. What were those cracks, and are they going to be resolved at all in upcoming elections?
Well, Sam, folks will remember that throughout November, there were a bunch of points in the process that take us as a country from the average voter going to the polls to vote or putting their ballot in the mail to actually certifying the results of the election on a state-by-state basis. And then eventually, we haven't seen this happen yet, but the Electoral College meeting and anointing someone as the next president. And for basically our entire history, certainly our entire modern history, that process has unfolded basically as a series of bureaucratic rituals without controversy, really with the exception of Florida in 2000, which everybody remembers well. But the process of county election boards certifying the results of an election, state certification boards approving the results of the election, state legislatures overseeing that process and allowing it to unfold smoothly, and secretaries of state doing the same. All of this has unfolded pretty much automatically in the past, including in some pretty contested elections like 2016. What President Trump has done and what his legal team, folks like Rudy Giuliani, have done is to try to weaponize each of those stages in the process, to turn them into sort of miniature battlefields where you try to prevent the certification of results in Wayne County, Michigan, that's Detroit, or you try to encourage the Secretary of State of Georgia to hold up certification of the results there, even in the absence of any evidence that anything has gone wrong there. And what we saw in the last few weeks is that if at any point the people involved in that process at the ground level had behaved with somewhat less integrity or had been more willing to abandon their functional bureaucratic responsibilities, we could have had a real holdup in the certification of one state or more. The fact that you had the president essentially exposing these options that another candidate in the future might have for messing with the results of an election, especially if it were an election that's closer and more seriously contested than this one. And at the end of the day, the election that we have just seen was not especially close, and that the president would have had to use these instruments in not just one state, but several states and several big states to actually thwart the carrying out of the popular will. But if this election had come down to one state, let's say Georgia, and the Republican Secretary of State there had been more of a down-the-line Trump ally who was willing to compromise the integrity of his office for partisan purposes, we could be looking at a genuine national crisis right now, when what we have instead is this, I think, really unseemly and this moment that really clashes with our expectations of American democracy, where the outcome of the process has never really been in doubt.
So, Alex, were we protected by the system, by the laws in place, or were we protected in this case by the integrity, by the conscience of the people who were in place? I
think it's a combination of those things, but most of all by the fact that the Biden victory margin was ultimately pretty convincing. That I think that, you can say the system worked more or less. You can say that the people on the front lines in these places had integrity more or less. But I think the real question would be, how would they behave in a situation where you had a margin like Florida in 2000 and a president like President Trump, who was willing to go way beyond where the Bush and Gore legal teams ever contemplated going to try to obstruct the carrying out of an election. I think there's very, very little from the spectacle that we just saw that should give us a great confidence that our system would hold up under a scenario like the one I just described.
Reid, it's still 6-7 weeks until Joe Biden takes office as the president on Inauguration Day, January 20th. Is Donald Trump sabotaging the incoming administration? What is he doing to put in place things that Joe Biden can't change? What is he doing to lock in place things that the new president is going to inherit that he may not want?
Well, we saw just this week that Attorney General Bill Barr named a special prosecutor to look into the origin of the federal investigation into the president's ties to Russia, which has been sort of part of the original sin of the Trump administration. That sort of effort that sparked the Mueller investigation has been going on since before he took office, and is something that the president's allies have argued for years was a partisan witch hunt. And so just continuing that investigation into the Biden administration is something that I suspect the Biden team, whoever he names as his attorney general, would prefer not happen. I think we can expect to see at various agencies in Washington an array of attempts at rulemaking or executive orders that go into place between now and January 20th that certainly the Biden administration would be able to reverse, but will gum up the works and force their attention away from other priorities that they may prefer to be spending time on. As far as the president himself, I mean, I think it shouldn't be too much of a surprise to anyone that he's willing to go, like Alex has said, like well beyond what has been deemed acceptable in presidential transitions in the past. The Obama administration, while they maintained a peaceful transfer to President Trump, they certainly tried to enact rules and regulations that the Trump administration would then have to figure out how to reverse once they took over. I think we can expect to see the Trump people do that with an order of magnitude more than what they inherited 4 years ago.
Alex, we talked about the fact that Joe Biden said the reason he ran for president, and this is kind of a lofty reasoning on his part, one might say, was his concern for the soul of the country. If that's so, and we'll give him the benefit of the doubt for that, what does it say when more than 70 million people voted for the other guy? What does that say about the soul of the country?
Well, it certainly says that the country's deeply, deeply divided right now. I think the real test of sort of the soul of the country and Joe Biden's sort of proposed salve for the soul of the country will be how many of those 74 million or so people who voted for President Trump are open to reassessing Joe Biden once he is actually governing, and what they expect from both parties in Washington going forward. Because look, as you alluded to before, it's very, very difficult to unseat an incumbent president in this country. And Biden managed to do it by a pretty solid margin that you don't often see in American politics. He managed to beat an incumbent president with a majority of the vote, which is something that has not happened at any other point in my lifetime, and has not happened in many decades. So I think that there is clearly an opening here for Biden to reach out to those voters and to try to make the case, and he has indicated that he wants to do this. That all you folks who voted for President Trump, feeling that you were getting the raw end of the deal in the global economy, I want to do stuff for you, and I want to show you that there's a better way to address the pain that you're feeling. But I think it's a really open question how many of those voters are sort of interested in hearing that proposal from Biden, and whether Biden is correct in thinking that you can separate out the sort of economic grievances and economic pain of President Trump's electoral coalition from the cultural and racial grievances that are so incompatible with Biden's message and that he really sees as being threats to the soul of America.
Reid, a quick last question, if I may. We're hearing a lot of talk about pardons, one way or the other, people involved, preemptive pardons, if you will, of people around the president, the relatives, other people, including Rudy Giuliani. Preemptive pardon, kind of an interesting get-out-of-jail-free card concept. Can the president pardon himself?
That is not entirely clear. It's one of these questions that's never been tested in the pardon system. There's been various fanciful scenarios thrown around, like the president would resign on the morning of the inauguration day and have Pence pardon him. It's the one thing that we have learned watching Trump from his campaign to his presidency is that we fail oftentimes to have the proper imagination to figure out what he might do. And so could he pardon himself? Maybe. Could he try? Maybe. Would it work? We don't know. The one thing that's clear on the pardon system is that the president has the authority to pardon people for federal crimes. And a lot of the problems that President Trump is running into, legal problems that he's running into at the moment, are in state courts, particularly in New York, where there's very aggressive attorney general and district attorneys involved. And his pardons would not reach those points. And so I don't think we know also yet the extent to which a Biden Justice Department would be interested in investigating or prosecuting the president himself or the people around him. There isn't an attorney general designate that at the point we're taping this, and so we don't know kind of how big a deal that will be in the end anyway.
Right. So we'll have to stay tuned as usual. Alex Burns, Reid Epstein of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. And coming up next, drastic service cuts in store for New York subways and buses. New York's transit agency, the MTA, is facing the worst financial crisis in its history. Due to the COVID crisis, revenues from fares and state and local subsidies are way down. The MTA facing a budget hole of $12 billion for 2020 and 2021. The deficit will hit $16 billion by 2024. Subway ridership up since its lowest levels last spring, but still only 30% of pre-pandemic levels. The agency is preparing a so-called doomsday plan. It could include service cuts of 40% on subway and bus lines and 50% on the commuter rail lines. The Times cites a NYU study about the potential economic impact of the service cuts. Quote, by 2022, the MTA's plan could cost the region as many as 450,000 jobs, resulting in $50 billion in lost earnings. If all that wasn't bad enough, the Times also reports that violent crimes on the subways are on the rise. Let's get some perspective on it all from New York Times transit reporter Christina Goldbaum. Christina, is all this the result of the pandemic, of people staying at home? Are they safety issues? Is it the result of deficits from declining ridership, or a combination of all of that?
It's essentially a combination of all of that. I mean, ridership is at 30% of usual levels right now. It's been the longest period of suppressed ridership in the MTA's history. And again, the MTA is an agency that relies on fares and tolls for 40% of its operating budget. So that's been a huge hit for the agency, and they are not expecting ridership to reach around 90% of usual until 2024. So this will be a long-term financial crisis for the agency, which is why they've asked for $12 billion in federal aid, to cover their deficit through the end of next year. I think it's so important when we're talking about the doomsday cuts, though, to consider both the kind of political lobbying line as well as the financial bottom line. So part of the reason that transit officials in New York and other major cities have been talking about these doomsday cuts that would predominantly affect riders is to pressure Washington to provide more federal aid, keep lights on their system. At the same time, they are facing a very stark financial bottom line. And so that means that while it might not be likely that they get $12 billion in federal aid to cover, their entire financial deficit, maybe they get some of that federal aid, but not all of it, we will very likely see some of these cuts, maybe not 40% on subways or buses, but, some cuts happening next year. Also recently, transit officials were talking about not just making those cuts to, cover their financial losses, but also doing so to right-size service now that ridership has remained so low for so long. And again, they're not expecting it to come back. So in addition to saving money and helping kind of fill their huge budget hole, they're also saying, listen, we don't have as many riders using the system. We need to look at where ridership is coming back and then changing the way that we're running the subway and bus lines in order to adjust for that, while also saving some money on the side. But again, all of this adds up to, if not, 40% on subways and buses, 50% on commuter lines, we will see some of these cuts come to pass next year.
Christine, if we have scheduled fare increases and they are still on schedule, and if we have now proposed in cutting services, whether it's 40% or 50% or somewhere much less, doesn't all that become self-fulfilling? If service gets worse, don't fewer people wind up using mass transit?
That's exactly what happens. It's called what transit officials or, officials and advocates would call a transit death spiral, where, right now we have 30% of riders using the system. We'll ask them to pay more money next year because of a scheduled, increase for less reliable service. And then at a point where more people might be coming back to the system, where maybe office workers would also be going in a couple of days or 5 days a week, you're then asking them to pay more for less service, and they might be less inclined then to use a subway. Maybe they will request to work from home more days a week. Maybe they will choose to drive into Manhattan, and then we'll have, massive issue with gridlock in the city from more car traffic. And then, years down the line, you're going to have an MTA system that still doesn't have riders. They can't get riders to come back. That is still financially hurting them. And maybe 4 years down the line, they'll be less likely to get any kind of assistance from the city, state, or the federal government to support them. And that's, again, it's called this death spiral of transit that agencies across the country, not just in New York, are now facing.
Is there any positive to this with fewer riders? Is there any savings in operating the system with the subway closed at night, at least in the interim? Is there any savings to that? Is there any ability to repair the system more easily and more quickly with less traffic on the subway system?
Yeah, so earlier on in the pandemic, the MTA managed to move forward with certain infrastructure projects that they already had funding for, in part because of the overnight shutdown, in part because it was easier to kind of redirect service where they needed to. So that was, a kind of silver lining early on. But they are also, saving some money by not operating trains for passengers overnight. But I think, again, it's hard to say that there are a ton of positives from, having fewer riders now, because the projects that they could move forward with, they already have. There isn't any funding for any new infrastructure projects, so they can't move forward with any more of those and be able to take advantage of, having less service overnight and, throughout the week as well.
And why is crime getting worse? If there are fewer people on the subways, why is crime rising?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. So in the last couple of months, we've seen violent crimes rising. So we've seen increase in felony assaults and robberies, incidents of rape, and also murder on the system. And we've seen still a decline in more petty crimes. So maybe someone getting pickpocketed who's a rider. And in talking to police officials, what they believe might be happening is that maybe there are fewer targets for criminals to steal someone's purse or steal some money. But criminals who are more inclined to commit larger crimes, like pushing somebody onto a subway track, feel more emboldened to do so because there are fewer witnesses on the subway platform as well. And so, what the new transit police chief has said is that there were some police resources that were also redirected to cover protests before the election earlier on in the summer. So they were redirected from the subway system. They've now been put back in the subway system. It's about 120 police officers who are now back in the system. But again, the kind of dynamic of having fewer witnesses on a platform, that's going to persist as long as there are fewer riders. And again, it makes that sell to riders harder when you're trying to get them to come back. And in addition to being worried about public health concerns, paying more or less service, they'll also have to be worried about more violent crime as they're using the system as well.
And how much of the fall off in ridership do we think is the result of the pandemic, and how much of it is the result of things like crime? Are these riders ever going to come back because offices are not asking people to come back to work?
Yeah, I think the decline in ridership we're seeing now really is because of the pandemic. I think the folks who are riding right now are mostly folks who are essential workers, so they have to go into work, or other low-income workers who have to go into work in person still. It's actually quite interesting. We've seen, some of the busiest stations in Midtown Manhattan, ridership is still at around 20% of usual in those stations.
Mm-hmm.
In the outer boroughs, the further out you get from the city center, ridership is back at many of those stations in Queens, and the Bronx, and Brooklyn to around 50% of usual. So it really is people who must use the subway who are riding. And so, crime might not deter them because they have to get on the subway or bus. It's the only way to get to work. But again, for folks who have the option later on, that's when I think we're going to see crime come into play with ridership.
Christina Goldbaum of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.